Hi, Kara. Welcome to Cosmic Heartist. I am so excited to have you here. For everybody listening, I met Kara through Poems and Power, which I've spoken about a lot here. We've spoken about Chelsea a lot here. I've had a couple girls from Poems and Power, and I love talking to people from this community because I feel like these are such big women, and I see that in you as well. And from the minute we started talking and you were sharing with me about your book, I knew I wanted to hear more about it just because of your passion for it and the way you were speaking about it. So, first, I would love for you to introduce yourself and introduce what you love and what are some of your favorite things in the world.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm Kara Dobias. I am going to be talking about my first poetry book, Alive, and my favorite things. Honestly, anything creative. I like to call myself a very multidisciplinary artist. In addition to writing poetry, I'm a singer. I was a theater major in college, so I also have that performance background and a dance background as well. Those are really the things that light me up. Just being able to work on my own creative projects brings me so much joy. And I'm really grateful that I have a lot of other artistic friends that I'm able to collaborate with, a lot of whom actually helped me with different phases of my books. So that's kind of me summed up.
Let's get a little picture of when you started working on your book and what began that journey.
Okay, so I like to tell this story. Again, kind of includes my friends. So I started working on this book in October of 2022. At that point, I didn't really know that it was going to be a book. I had always written, I have a stack of journals that I've kept since middle school, actually, which is interesting to go back and look at sometimes. And I had just kind of taken a step back from writing at that point. And I had gone out with two of my friends from college that evening. And it was just one of those nights that really stood out in my mind as being really memorable. I just felt really grateful for their friendship. And so I decided to write a poem called Found. And in that poem, I kind of detail some of those moments from our night together and just feeling so grateful for their friendship. It also, this hangout came after a kind of difficult period of my life. I had been a little bit shut off from people, and it was the first time in a while I had really gone out. So the poem also kind of discusses that of like when you have gone through this period of time where you feel a little bit disconnected from yourself and the things that kind of bring you back to it. And my friends have always been part of that, of kind of reminding me who I am and just filling my cup and making me feel so loved. So I wrote this poem, not really thinking anything of it. And I shared it with those two friends. I was like, I wrote this. I'm pretty proud of it. Thank you. Had a great night. And it was one of those friends who was like, wow, this is really good. You should share this on social media. And he said, he's like, you have a voice and it's resonant. And that quote I actually wrote down because it stood out to me because I think it was something that I needed to hear. And so I posted it again, not really thinking anything of it. And it did really well. A lot of people commented that they really resonated with it. And I think that was kind of a turning point for me of, oh, wow, like, yeah, I do have a voice. I have something to say. Maybe I'll get back into writing again. And so from that, I just started kind of on my own whenever there was something I wanted to remember, or just things I was processing at that time, I started writing. And then somewhere along the way there, end of 2022, I was like, you know what? I think I want more people to see this. What if I wrote a book? And that was kind of the impetus for that. And here we are 2 years later, right before the release.
And having seen like little glimpses and little quotes of your book, I am super excited to read it as well. And before we get further into your book, because I definitely want to know more about it, I'm curious to know before you were working on your book and before you decided to go back into writing, what was your main form of art and main form of expression, and how did writing come back into the picture? Or, I mean, I know you used to journal, but we always have that point where we go from journaling to writing and taking our own writing more seriously. So when did that happen for you, other than this moment of sharing it with your friends?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, I was a theater major in college, which came at a very interesting time because I graduated the year after COVID. So I graduated in 2021. COVID, obviously, as we know, hit in 2020. And being a theater major, that very much disrupted how we were able to work. We couldn't be in person. We had to be doing Zoom classes, which, especially for a theater major, you might wonder how that's really possible because you're not really actually able to do your medium. So I had my senior year, a capstone project that was supposed to be that we were going to write a original show with a theater company, Tectonic Theater Company in New York City, and we would have performed it live, but that wasn't able to happen because of the restrictions. So we ended up doing this Zoom kind of performance where we recorded things separately and it was cut together. And I was a co-writer on that show, in addition to acting. So I got to have all these different hands in that process. So from developing the show to writing it to performing in it. And like I mentioned before, because I see myself as a very multidisciplinary artist, that just lit me up. I loved that process so much. It really helped me during that time because it gave me something to focus on and it was a little bit of an escape. And so once I graduated, I think that that was kind of the thing that had really stood out to me. And I was like, well, how am I going to be able to, how can I recapture this feeling for myself now that I'm not in an academic setting and I'm trying to get into the professional world? And maybe I don't really have the credentials that everyone is looking for. And so, yeah, I think part of my writing was a way for me to give myself permission to work on a long form project, not really needing another person to guide me because I was writing about my life, obviously. And it was kind of the first project that I felt that I wasn't necessarily looking to someone else to tell me if it was going to be good enough. Every poem, I knew it was done when I felt like it was done. And the edits also came from that place of self-assurance. And I think that that was really important to me at that time, just because of other things that were happening in my life. And it kind of brought me back to me in that sense. And it was really empowering. Um, I also wrote about things that I felt like were important for me to hear, but I recognize the significance of it for other people. And something that I had loved about theater and those that show that we developed my capstone year, and what I was journaling about at that time actually when I had gone back and looked was I wanted to be an artist whose work had an impact and a purpose. So if I was going to be working on a show or if I was going to be writing something or singing something, I always wanted to be part of work that I felt was impactful and helped other people. So I kind of saw this project as a way for me to do that too, because I was writing about things that I felt like I was working through and I needed to hear. And so that was also part of my thought process and that of like, well, maybe other people need to hear this too. And oh, okay, then I can fulfill that, personal desire of mine to making art that I think is going to help people on some level and find the audience that it needs to. So that was kind of the transition over.
I feel like that's always how it begins, isn't it? That we're writing for ourselves and we're writing exactly what we need to hear. And just in the process, realizing one, it's going to help someone else, and two, just the ability to get recognized for our multidimensionality. There is such magic in that. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about the trailer, so to speak, that you posted on your Instagram of the book, and just feeling into all the words that you used and how deeply poetic all of that was, and the video and the one look that you gave, and how much one look can say, and I think it's so cool to have all of these different tools that you can tie in together and then use all of this to express yourself in a way, like you said, that is impactful. And when you're using all these different aspects of yourself, it naturally becomes impactful no matter what you're doing, I feel like. So that's really fascinating to witness, and really nice to just see your words actually pulling through in the kind of, you know, the kind of I want to say feeling that you produce, because you produce art, but then art translates to feelings, right? So going deeper into your book, I remember when you were talking about it when we were speaking on voice notes, you mentioned that you would love for it to be something that destigmatizes mental health. And that's something that really stood out to me. And I'm curious to know before we dive deeper into the like meat of your book, how you feel like you do this and how you feel like you've been able to translate this through the words that you use in your book.
Sure. Yeah. So that is definitely a big part of it. Also, I feel like sort of the origin story of the book. So as I mentioned, I started writing it in 2022. I had graduated in 2021, and I feel like this can be a pretty common experience for a lot of people upon graduating, is you're kind of thrust into the real world and you're like, all right, what's next? And for me personally, because that kind of came on the cusp of COVID and so much had changed, I really kind of found myself in this place of, oh, well, maybe what I thought I wanted isn't what I wanted, or it looks so much different now. And what is this path forward? And that really got me kind of into this not so great headspace. I kind of I felt bad that I didn't have all the answers, as I saw some of my friends who had other majors or other things going on, and so I kind of fell into this sadness, which was really impactful for me at that moment because I noticed how it was causing me to look at myself. I felt this sense of shame that, I kind of let myself get so low and that I couldn't show up as my, more normally optimistic self or passionate self because of just the way that I was feeling and the way that I was feeling really disconnected from everything. Um, And so I knew what was happening internally, but obviously from an outside perspective, if you're not sharing those things with people, I think sometimes people just, you never know what people are going through. And so I felt like how people were perceiving me was not how I wanted to be perceived. And so, because I knew that I wasn't showing up in the way that I wanted to. So I started writing about it when I was able to more fully process everything that I was feeling. And I think writing about it was a way for me to tell myself, look, like, you're okay. Like, maybe you're not where you want to be right now, but you're okay. Maybe you're feeling sad and you're in this low, but you aren't those feelings. Those are just feelings, and it's okay to express them and it's okay to work through them. And you're going to get beyond them, but you aren't the sadness. You're not this phase of your life. You're more than that. So I started to kind of write about those things, recognizing that, I know I'm not the only one who's ever felt this way. It's just that we don't want to talk about that. I think sometimes people don't always know how to handle when we're talking about depression or anxiety or those lower energy feelings. I think people want to be supportive, but we don't always have the words. And so I think sometimes what happens is that, and again, I think people generally are well meaning, but it kind of sometimes comes across like they feel bad for you. And I didn't want to be looked at as, you know, I didn't want to be pitied. I didn't want that kind of energy. So I think writing about it too was a way for me to sort of move beyond that and to offer my words for anyone else who may find my work and read that and maybe be also going through that and be like, okay, well, I don't have to be defined by this. And this isn't something to make a spectacle of. It just is what it is. This is the season of life that we're in. And yeah, so I think something I did in my book is that I wanted to talk about the things that, you know, often we kind of shy away from. Just to, make it more part of our conversation. That's another reason I'm really thankful that I have a really strong support system in my friends, is because they give me the space to do that. And I recognize that not everyone has that. So I think another part of my why for writing the book was that when you're reading these poems about my life and things I went through and these feelings that I had, I want you to kind of feel like you have that friend who's sharing this with you. And so that now you can reflect on your own experiences and be like, okay, I'm going to be okay too. So I think that is kind of how I wanted to approach those subjects. And even though it was very vulnerable for me to do, I recognized the value of that and the potential impact of that. And so, yeah.
That's profound in so many ways because there is art that's fluffy and beautiful. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with fluffy art because it makes us feel good. Again, the feeling that comes through art. But I resonate so much with what you're saying, especially in the last few months. I have found such solace in art, in poetry, in being able to capture exactly the textures of what I'm feeling in poetry. Um, and like you said, a lot of things are not spoken about enough. A lot of the darker things aren't spoken about enough because they're labeled as darker, I guess, which is why they get shadowed away and why we don't speak about them. But we realize the more we speak about them, I think we realize we're not that different at all. And also um we can bring so much more to the conversation. You know, when we stop staying on the surface and when we stop just talking about what's beautiful, because yes, what's beautiful is also important, of course. But when we just dip deeper, there is so much more there. And I think using that as um part of what you're doing as you're communicating your book, like I also I'm thinking about how you said that you want to alchemize these emotions, you want to, you know, create art out of them, you want to create art out of the deep muck. And I think, what else is there to do, right, out of this deep muck? Like, what else are we meant to do? um because we're meant to feel it. And then, of course, we're not meant to drown in it. We're meant to do something with it. And what else to do other than alchemize it and help it, not help it, but have it be something that helps us, and not only us, but everyone else around us. So I want to know more about your book and about your process in writing it and your process of getting it into these places within yourself, because they're not the easiest places to get to. Of course, they come through when we're having a more negative experience, like a fight or a heartbreak or a breakup or anything deeper. But other than that, I mean, that is ritual in itself. But other than that, also, like, what are your methods of getting deep within yourself to write about this kind of truth?
Yeah. So on that note, also of talking about difficult things, something that I wanted to do within my work, and I think is really important for any artist, is that I think there's a way that you can talk about difficult subjects or difficult things that you've gone through in a way where you can relay that you've processed it yourself. So you're not putting that work on your audience. And I think that that's a really big thing to think about. When we're talking about, oh, it's important to talk about the quote unquote darker things, okay, but do so in a way where you're not introducing trauma then to your audience. And I think that's what I try to do as well. So like, though I would say that, I talk about depression in the book and I talk about heartbreak in the book, um, I had done my processing on my own. And so what I'm now sharing is kind of my reflection on those things. And so I'm introducing those emotions, but I feel like in a way that it's still palpable, I guess, to the audience, or it's not going to make you feel like, okay, now I'm carrying this thing too. One of my friends had said something in my work that I really appreciated, that I end on very hopeful notes in my poems. And I think that that is something I was trying to be aware of, is that, okay, if the first line of the poem starts a little bit lower or is a little sad or what have you, by the end of the poem, I want you to know that we're not going to stay there. And I didn't stay there, right? So I take you through this journey. So my writing process really is, I feel like this book came about in a very organic way, because from the start, I didn't know, like, okay, this is going to be the title and this is exactly what I'm going to write about. I really was just writing about what I needed to at that time. So I was having these big feelings about things that I was going through, and I was like, okay, I'm going to put it on the page and we're going to see what's going to come out, basically. And so sometimes I would go in with kind of like an idea of like what that poem was going to be. Sometimes I'd come in with like a first line that had come to me. Um, and other times it just like I just grabbed my journal and I just wrote. It's actually interesting because the first poem in the book, which is also the title poem, Alive, was one of those poems where it was one evening and I just grabbed my journal and the entire poem just came out full form. which doesn't always happen, but it was just, that was one of those poems where I'm like, all right, this is what you need to say. And so I think I let it kind of be that organic process. Like I know when I need to write, I know when I need to kind of get all of my thoughts out of my head and onto the page to process. And then, it's after that that I can go back and refine it or decide if it's something that I feel like is worth sharing or, okay, no, maybe that was just for me. Um, but yeah, that's kind of, I feel like how I work. I don't ever try to force it. If it feels forced, then I'm like, okay, you're trying too hard. Because I feel like my best work comes from that place of authenticity, and it's really a meditative process for me, quite honestly. I think like especially when there were longer pieces in the book that I was working on, I'd usually work on it at night when things were quiet and I just put on some nice music and kind of get myself into this headspace of like, all right, this is my designated writing time and we're going to see if this is going to flow the way that I want it to. And if it doesn't, okay, we'll revisit it at another time. Nothing is forced, nothing is like, all right, that I think that's how I've been able to preserve that essence of vulnerability and write what I feel like wasn't just going to resonate for me, but to my audience as well.
So after getting all pieces of your book together, having all the pieces that you decided, you wanted to have these pieces out into the world, um, what were the next steps? Because I'd love for anyone listening to this podcast that's like, hey, I have some art, I want to share it with the world. It may be 5 pieces, it may be 10 pieces, but I feel like there is a message here and I want the world to hear it. What was your process after?
So when I knew that I had written what turned out to be the last poem, and I felt like, all right, I have enough and I feel like I've said what I need to say, I took all the poems that I was considering putting in the book, printed them out, and then put them into categories, and then ordered those categories, and then sort of, it was very much like a puzzle, and kind of sifting them um, into different iterations, um, different ways of, okay, how am I going to tell this story? Because I think some poets choose to have sections within their book of, okay, these are my love poems, these are my mental health poems, whatever your topics happen to be. And I knew that I wanted this to read more like a larger narrative. It's not necessarily linear, but it's not broken up. So when you're going through and you're reading it through, it makes sense. Like there's rhyme and reason to it. Um, so that's kind of what I did. Once I had my categories, I reordered those into a way that I felt like made sense thematically. Um, and yeah, that was sort of my process. Because I knew that I wanted that structure of it being kind of this overarching story rather than broken up into chapters.
And you have photos in there as well, right?
I do, yes. So that was another thing that, again, going with that kind of multidisciplinary nature, I was like, you know what? I'll give them words, I'll give them photos, like I'll make this as much of an experience as I can because I just love to work that way. So yeah, so some of the photos are my own. Some are other photos that I found that I was able to use. Two of the photos are famous paintings that I actually based two of those poems off of. So one of them is it's a painting that I had first seen at the Met Museum in New York. It's called Portia, and it's painted by the painter Sir John Everett Millais. And it is a picture of Portia from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. And so it accompanies my poem called Portia, which is a metaphor for a relationship that I had been in. Because another thing that I love about poetry is I feel like even if you are writing about your life, you still kind of get to play in this world of characters and metaphor. And so it's kind of like, okay, I can talk about these real things, but I also can keep that a little bit that level of distance. I don't have to tell them everything, but I can share these really real feelings and I can talk about these really real things, but I get to play with that a little bit. So Portia's in there. I have another poem, Joan, and that's Joan of Arc. Again, using Joan of Arc as a metaphor for for a relationship, which might be the first time you've ever heard that. And so the painting is of Joan of Arc as well. So yeah, so the pictures that accompany some of the poems either directly related to the content and what the poems were based off of, or were just kind of visuals that added to what I was talking about within those pieces.
Okay, so I absolutely love these glimpses into your poems, and I want more glimpses. Can you share with us some of your favorite titles and some of the favorite accompanying experiences of these favorite poems of yours? Or if they're not your favorite poems, just the poems that stand out that you're like, I am so excited for the world to see this.
I'm gonna pull up my poem list because I know the first poem I wanted to reference, but see if there's like any other ones that stand out. So definitely one of the ones that I'm most proud of as well is called Antithetical Anthem. That is the last poem in the book, and it's I didn't intend it this way, but again, as I said, I feel like the book came very organically in the sense of like when it was done, I realized, oh, wow, this is actually a summary sort of everything that I've given you before. And in a way, you could look at it as sort of a resolution to where we begin. And so, Antithetical Anthem talks about how, as you know, a woman in her mid 20s, confronting all of these pressures that I was feeling, and sort of flipping the script and acknowledging that, there isn't one correct way to live a life. There isn't, you know, rarely is anything linear. Rarely does anything exist in black and white. So it's that kind of like discussing the contradictions. So in it, as an example, like I talk about not being at that point currently in a relationship. But that doesn't mean that I'm not loved because I have my best friends who show up for me and I have that type of love, right? So that duality of like, okay, well, maybe sometimes I feel lonely because I don't have a significant other, but look at all this other love that's pouring into my life. I talk about how I think it was me kind of confronting this idea again because this book was written post grad of like these expectations that are placed on us of like, okay, so you go to school for 12 years and then you go and you get your higher education degree and then you get your job and then you go and you get married and maybe start a family. It's like this structure that I feel like we're kind of told from a very young age, and then you get to those ages where those things are quote unquote supposed to be happening, and if you don't have them, you're like, oh my god, what am I doing? I'm freaking out now. And so that in that poem, I'm kind of like, why are we so concerned with sort of like hitting these benchmarks that have been pre-decided for us when those might not be the right things for us at this moment in time, or might not ever be the right things for us, like just acknowledging that we have a lot more freedom to live our lives than I think we're initially told. And so yeah, that poem kind of talks about that duality and those conflicting feelings, of okay, well, maybe I don't have this, but I have this other great thing. And you know what? Well, maybe you can't see what I'm building for myself, but that doesn't mean it's not there. So I have a line about like, well, maybe I don't have a 10-year plan, but that doesn't mean I don't have a vision for my life. And some things you just can't see beneath the surface, but it's there. So just confronting that as well. So I really like that one. I think that is a really strong poem. And there was a lot in it for me as well. Another poem that I would say that, again, it's another longer poem, but again, a lot in there. And I think it was me confronting a lot of beliefs and messages that I had been receiving and holding on to. It's called My Body Belongs to Nobody. This is one that I feel like will really resonate with the women who read it. And that's who I wrote it for. And I wrote it for myself as well. But it kind of discusses this idea that as women, our bodies are viewed in a way that kind of removes us from the equation from a very young age. So I talk in this poem about body image and about how, our bodies, before we're older, can often be commented on or critiqued, in the sense of weight. So that's what I opened that poem with, because that had been my experience. And so how I noticed how, okay, from a young age, my body's already being critiqued in this way. And then once I got older and I was becoming a woman, then it was being critiqued in a more sexualized way, and kind of what that did, to my relationship and perception of my body, and questioning why do we do that. Not to say that men don't have similar experiences, but I think we can agree that women have it in a much more harsher way. Um, and so I really kind of wanted to talk back to all of that commentary and all of those experiences that I had had, to take back my power and be like, you know what, actually, I have worth beyond how I look, and that's not yours to dictate or to comment on. And yeah, and so kind of taking back that narrative for myself, and also expressing that anger, quite honestly, that I had about that. So I'm also really proud of that, because again, I think that that's a poem. When I said earlier that I wanted to talk about things that, you know maybe generally, we say, okay, well, maybe we should steer away from these topics, maybe we shouldn't go there, and I kind of told myself, why not? Why can't I talk about these things? These are my experiences. And so again, like, I wanted that to be a poem that was empowering to me, but also empowering to my reader, of like, you know what, maybe you've also had these similar experiences, but you get to take your power back, you get to say no more. Yeah.
There's so much in everything that you said. I want to first say that I super see all of your big three signs and everything that you said, because I like to call this podcast Cosmic Heartist. And I haven't been doing the best job of tying in astrology, but that's like what I love to do. So just listening to you speak, I could so hear that Scorpio and that powerful side and that like will to go into the deep. And then that Sag and that Aries of, listen, this is what I went through. So this is what I'm going to speak about. I don't care if you don't like it, because it's something that I actually went through. You can maybe have an opinion if you go through it too, but if you're just judging it based on what I went through, I'm going to talk about it. And there's like, that's power, right? That's power, being like, this happened to me and I'm going to talk about it. And I don't care if you don't like it. And I want to go back to the first poem that you shared about, and the societal standards, and how insane it is that, these standards were created so freaking long ago, and yet it's kind of what we base our lives on. I mean, we went through a whole pandemic, like you said, you're a theater major and you had to do part of it on Zoom. Was that part of these structures? Like, did they say what happens if that happens? Does that delay anything? Does that change
Mhm.
anything? There is no gray area in the societal standards that were created. So to go head to head through a poem, I think is such an amazing way to be like, hey, I have something to say and this is what I have to say. And just the magic of a poem being able to encapsulate something so big, that's incredible. And then also, I love how you spoke about bodies being critiqued, and how is that okay? Like, and how is it okay that through different parts of our lives, there are different things being said about our bodies? And I can so resonate with, when I was younger, I was skinny and people would say, eat more food, why aren't you eating? Why are you so thin? And then I went to college in the States and ate dining hall food. And we all know what happens with dining hall food, and gained a bunch of weight and came back home. And everybody was like, hey, what happened? You gained so much weight. And I'm like, okay, first of all, I was a kid back when you knew me. Before college, I was not a woman. Second of all, who are you to ask about my weight? Like, we haven't seen each other in years. And your first thing is, oh, you gained weight. And why is that okay? So again, meeting that with a poem, I think that's so powerful, being like, hey, I have something to say about this too. And also, you know what? It's not okay. And just the thought that women have had to, think about this and struggle through this for so long, I think it's laughable almost. I mean, laughable in the worst way possible, right? Because
Yeah.
I'm thinking like Lilith laughing, like rage, like like
Hmm.
laughing out balls of dragon fire. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly it. Like, I think that in thinking about these larger topics, especially for those two poems that I just shared about, um, I just kind of, it's always irked me when there's kind of been this more dominant belief in any subject of like, okay, well, this is how things have always been, or like we've always talked about things this way, so that's just the way to do it. And I think that I'm very much the type that I like to question things. I especially, again, you point out like the absurdity of it, right? It's like I don't want to accept this anymore. As a woman, I don't want to be talked about this way. I don't like, and part of the My Body Belongs to Nobody poem also came from a personal experience of, on multiple occasions, happened to be men, but men being surprised that I was smart because I was pretty. And that kind of that, that's so dumb. Like, oh yeah, because those things have to exist on their own. Like they can't possibly, exist together, right? So like that's also part of that poem too, of like, because when we really dive into it and we talk about it, it's like, wow, this is crazy. Like, why do we just accept this, right? And so I think all of this too, and on that note, this book was a way for me to reclaim my voice and to say I do have things to say on these topics, and maybe it's going to make you a little bit uncomfortable, or maybe it's something you don't expect me to comment on or to say because I haven't in the past. But again, I think it was important for me on a personal level as well to break through that fear and be like, okay, well, if your opinion of me changes after I talk about these things that are important and obviously have merit, well, then maybe you didn't actually know me before. And that's on a larger note, I think what this book for me was a way for me to kind of reintroduce myself after a point in my life where I felt like so many variables had shifted and my perception of myself had changed so much, of getting back to that foundation of, okay, well then who am I actually? Yeah, and so I see this book as a way of like, if you didn't know me before or you think that you know me, well maybe you're gonna get to see me in a more authentic and a more real and a more honest light, because it's me telling my story and my experiences.
And poetry is so extremely vulnerable. Like,
Yeah.
I like to say that when I see someone's birth chart, I feel like I'm looking at them naked. And the only thing that has compared is poetry. It's like you can see a person, like, even though it's just one poem, the way that you can, like, I don't know, I think it's something about the heart frequency. Like when we read that person's like heart, when we read that art, it kind of shifts a tune within our own, and then something happens, and it's just this incredible adventure. All of this to say, I'm so excited to read your book, and I'm curious, would you like to share a poem?
Well, I think probably the best, because I don't want to give too much away, because I do love those two poems you were discussing, but I think I wanna leave that in the context of the book. But I could share the title poem. I think that's the
Yeah.
poem that you had found me from, that I had shared with Poems in Power. Um, it was the start of the book and kind of me approaching this question of, I mean, the book in its entirety kind of approaches the question, okay, what does it mean to be alive? This poem starts with what makes you feel most alive, because I think that that was something that I was thinking about at the time. Okay, what lights me up? What makes me excited? So I will pose this question to the audience. Here we go. What makes you feel most alive? I don't think enough people dare to ask this question, let alone answer it. I find myself in the unconventional. I don't know if this makes me ungrounded, but I like flirting with daydreams. I'm inspired by those who dare to see the impossible. Maybe some would say that I lack a sense of reality, but I would counter that they just aren't paying attention. I'm the kind of person who will try to find beauty in everything. Quite frankly, I don't see the point in being any other way. I want to surround myself with art and music. I want to dance away my pain and console myself with prose. You see, I'm doing it even now. I've tried to walk a straight path before, but my destiny has laughed at the notion that my life could possibly be linear. I don't always conform to the status quo. In fact, I'm getting more comfortable with coloring outside of the lines, though some would try to pull me back inside. I recognize that this may be a lonely life for me, one fraught with chasing the next big thing, the next rush of emotion, the next burst of creativity. But I've resigned myself to the reality that to be authentically me, I cannot be anything but vulnerable, sometimes painfully so. Sometimes I feel misunderstood. even by those who claim to love me the most. I cannot explain it. I'm at once altogether here, entirely present, but simultaneously projecting myself into a future that may never come to pass. In short, I think a lot about everything, all the time. Like how this moment is fleeting and I'll never be as I am now again, or how I fear losing those I love most because loss seems to be my closest confidant. I love fiercely, and I know that can be scary. I wish I knew what that felt like, to be on the receiving end of my love. I'm still learning how to fill my cup. To be alive is so achingly, terribly beautiful.
Be alive is so achingly, terribly beautiful. I love that part about going outside the lines and people trying to bring you back into the lines. Because what is being alive but coloring outside the lines? That is so beautiful. And that makes me want to ask you, what does a fully alive day look like for you?
Ooh, that's a good question. Um, I think what I kind of referenced earlier here is that, when I'm creating, especially when I'm creating with, people that I care about, that is the best thing to me. So, um, you know, being able, working on this book, the writing and the editing, that was a more solo process. But I'm lucky in the sense of the video that you referenced earlier, I worked on with a good friend of mine who's a videographer. And we're actually working on a separate video, a trailer for the book, because it's not over yet. And so we did a couple of filming days for that. We traveled for that to get these really amazing shots to um, encapsulate the feelings within the poems, some of the visuals within the metaphors of the poems. And those were some of the best days because it's something that I don't think a lot of people give themselves the opportunity or space to do, right? Like, I think part of being alive is taking a beat, slowing down, and just noticing. I think it's the act of noticing things in your environment. And so when you're filming or you're taking photos or you're writing about something, that gives you that opportunity to slow down and to look at all of these details and kind of bring them together into something greater. Yeah, that's when I feel most alive. It's me having those moments of just being so present. I think being alive is being present. It's how we interact with the world, it's the relationships that we have, which is all the things that I talk about in the book because how I was interacting with certain relationships, how I was perceiving myself through the lens of other people's opinions, how I was noticing things about my environment, all of that was helping me to better understand myself. And I think, too, that's what being alive is. It's this process of becoming, it's this process of, for X amount of years, I've had this perception of myself, and now these different elements are changing and now I'm viewing myself in a different light. But hey, that's growth and that's beautiful.
So, something that came up for me as you were speaking is how you were sharing that even though you dive deep into different emotions, you always end on a hopeful note. And I'm very curious to know when you are processing these deeper emotions, when you are like in the trenches, how do you come back up? And how do you remind yourself to see the hope?
So I would say I wrote a lot more than ended up being in the book. And some of those poems that didn't make the cut definitely just stayed in that lower energy. They were to put that hurt or that struggle on the page, and they didn't have that resolution. Um, so I think sometimes you just have to live in that for a minute to fully acknowledge it. Because if you acknowledge it and you let yourself work through it instead of trying to numb it or instead of being afraid of it and being like, this is really uncomfortable, I think that's also the process of releasing it. And that's the process of helping yourself gain perspective on it, right? So the poems that I have where I'm speaking about love and I'm speaking about heartbreak, those poems, they they're very reflective in the sense of I was able to kind of acknowledge like, okay, this wasn't so great, but I don't I don't have to be kind of defined by it. But I was only able to kind of get to that point by allowing myself just to be kind of like in the muck and mire of it, to have some not so great days, to write some poems that were just like, this is just really sad, and it's just gonna be sad, and I'm not asking it to be anything else because that's what it is, and I'm not gonna shame myself for feeling that because it's a very human thing. Um, so I think the hope comes through the process of working through, and I think that that's really can be the difficult part, and something I still have my days that are harder than others, of being able to acknowledge like, this is how I'm feeling right now. It's not so great, but this is not going to be forever. Um, so I think it's always trying to, even when it's difficult, have that thought of like, okay, well, I've been here before and I made it through before, so I'm going to make it through again. Or there is another side to what I'm feeling. This isn't forever. Just recognizing the impermanence of things, which I think also the book kind of talks about, of how life is so fleeting, it's so impermanent. So it's like we just have to get comfortable with sometimes just being uncomfortable, and things shifting, and recognizing that that's just part of getting to where we're going.
I think there's such grace in allowing this space for emotions to just be emotions without um trying to dissect it to find the hope sometimes, because like you said, like sometimes um I don't know, maybe we're really just in the muck and the hope doesn't exist, but remembering, like that's the important part, right? Remembering that we have the tools to get it out of the muck. We've gotten out before and we can get out again. And that gives us more permission to make art that's just really rough and really rugged and really like art that just needs to live out of us, because I feel like at the end of the day, that's the like that's not the main purpose of art, because art has so much purpose within it, but a big purpose of art is so that it can live outside of us and create more spaciousness within us. And I can speak from experience when I say every time I've been feeling really shitty and then I go and journal about it, all of a sudden I don't feel shitty anymore. So it's like honoring ourselves for being like, okay, I needed to write this. Maybe this is not art that needs to go into a book, but it's still art.
Exactly, yeah. And I think this book, I would say, so the hardest part for me of this book was actually writing the synopsis of, okay, how am I going to summarize these essentially 2 years of my life that was not the easiest? And how do I put this into something that's not going to deter people, that's, going to be honest, but not, you know, that darker side, I guess, or like to drudge up like those hard emotions. Um, and so just the act of writing the synopsis and working through that, I think made me recognize that releasing this book, like physically releasing this book, is actually also just like of an emotional release for me, of like, all right, we're finally closing that chapter, we're moving on, you learned the lessons, you got through it, you processed it, this is your story, and now you're handing it over to whoever it's going to find, and then they're going to be able to take from it what is going to be beneficial to them. So yes, I agree. Art in I think my art in particular has always also served that purpose of being a release. And this book in particular, though I was writing about things that were happening in the present, those other two poems I shared earlier, I think that was looking to the past to release those things that I had been carrying, because I knew that they were going to serve me going forward as well.
All right. So rounding up on your book, is there anything else you would like to share about, the process, about the poems that are in it, about how people can find it, where they can find it, when they can find it, and any of the logistics?
So the logistical end of it, I am wrapping that up as we speak, getting all of the final details together. I have a release date in my head, but I'm not going to share it yet until everything is finalized, but it will be shared on my Instagram. So on Instagram, I'm at Kara Dobias. I also have a website, karadobias.com. So both of those places, you'll be able to find my work, and that is where I'll be doing all of my updates about the book. It's going to be sold on two platforms, Ingram Spark and Amazon. I'm going to be doing a pre-sale, so that's going to be on Ingram Spark, and then it's going to transition to Amazon after the official release date. So that's where you'll be able to purchase it. In terms of the book, I mean, I would just say that I'm just really grateful to be able to share this work, and I'm really grateful for the support I've already received. I'm grateful for you having me on this podcast and being able to talk about it. It really, yeah, it is the deepest parts of me. But again, I'm just, as an artist, as a person, it seems kind of like a contradiction, but it's almost, sometimes it's very comfortable for me to be that vulnerable, because I think that makes me feel really seen. And I think that that would be another message about the book, is that when you allow yourself to be seen, even when you feel vulnerable and the vulnerability is a little uncomfortable, that's when you find the people who are going to be able to relate to you, and who aren't going to ask you to be someone that you're not, and are going to love you for you. So that's another thing that I think the book, a takeaway from the book, is let yourself be seen. um the uncomfortability of vulnerability is worth it, because you end up finding those people who are going to love you so hard. and and also, just like, if you're going through a hard time, that there is another side of it, and that you're going to make it through, and that you're not alone, because I've been there too. um and I really hope that my words can be a comfort for whoever needs them. And yeah, just so much love. So much love. This book is really, it's my heart in my hands, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
Spoken like a true Scorpio with the vulnerability. I think it's so often, right, that I meet a Scorpio that has so much depth, but just refuses to share it because of the barriers that are rightfully there. Um, but when Scorpios do share, it's just the most mystical, like, words and magic and art that I just want to devour. So thank you for stepping up and sharing your art and allowing the world to see it, and allowing the world to see you, and allowing us to see ourselves through you. So I have one last question for you. And my last question is, what makes you a artist?
I think it's that ability to share these really raw, unpolished parts of myself, to, because like I said, all of my art, no matter the medium, always comes from that heart space. Um, this book is it's a love letter, really. My art really, it is the truest portrayal of myself, and comes from those deepest parts of myself. It is, I think, it's so intertwined with my purpose here. um and so I would say that makes me a artist.
Throughout this entire podcast, like, everything that you've said shows how you are a artist, and how you really just, take these experiences and create art out of them. And, the fact that you are a multidisciplinary, I've never said that in my life, multidisciplinary artist. I think it's so cool. Again, like we were talking about earlier, how you're able to tie so many different things together. It makes me think of a spider web, and it also makes me wonder, like, what's going to come from you in the next, like, 5 years and 10 years. And I'm excited to be here and part of the unfolding. So thank you. Thank you for being on Cosmic Heartist, and thank you for sharing about your book.
Of course. Could I end with a quote, if I may?
Of course.
In true poet fashion. um I love this quote, and I want to share it with everyone. So the quote is, "Will I be something? Am I something?" And the answer comes, "You already are, you always were, and you still have time to be."